whether it comes to pricing, whether it comes to the quality, timeliness of delivery, whatever it may be. Incentives aren't always aligned. And that's where, I think it's one of the biggest challenges. It's not unique to Bon Secours Mercy Health. It's one of the biggest challenges within supply chain, especially when it comes to, I think, physician preference items. Incentives are not aligned.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Jordan Ohman, CFO of Supply Chain at Bon Secours Mercy Health. And Jordan is going to be the second person we've had on the Power Supply podcast with a finance background operating in a finance function within supply chain. And I think more and more as the finances get tighter and tighter in healthcare, we're going to see this come up a lot more. Jordan's going to kind of walk us through how he finds himself in this role, what stakeholder perspectives need to be considered for supply chain to be successful, and then also some tips on ways to talk finance. Gary?
No, I think it's bridging the gap. We got to make this happen, and it's a key piece of supply chain, and having it directly integrated into supply chain, it's going to be, I hope, in a robust conversation between the two. So looking forward to it.
All right, everybody, stay with us. We're going to be right back with Jordan Ohman and after just a short break.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Jordan Ohman, CFO for Supply Chain at Bon Secours Mercy Health. And Jordan, you and I got connected pretty recently. And what I love is trying to bring on people to Power Supply that aren't necessarily in the supply chain on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes they're working in other departments. Sometimes, supply chain may be reporting up, and in this case, as the chief financial officer, you're probably all things supply chain and many other things as well. And so getting your perspective for our audience today, I think is going to be wonderful. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jordan, why don't we just start with your current role and how you find yourself involved with healthcare supply chain?
Sure. Yeah. So my current role is I'm the Vice President for Finance and Business Intelligence within our supply chain team here at Bon Secours Mercy Health. I actually took on the role. My role expanded recently, and I was really focused primarily on the finance aspect of what we did within supply chain. But now I've taken on really all of our digital business intelligence pieces as well. So that's been new, really exciting. Obviously, just given where healthcare is going, where the digital space is going, I get to combine finance and everything, all things digital for our supply chain team here at BSMH.
Jordan, maybe dive a little deeper on what you're working on these days. What are some particular areas of focus in your role and for the organization?
I view my role as really trying to bring all the elements of supply chain together from a standpoint, like I said, from a digital standpoint and from a financial standpoint, and trying to bring clarity back to our teams, back to the organization about what we do in supply chain. And supply chain, I think if you ask someone who's not in supply chain, it's, oh, those are the guys who just, write up some contracts and make sure we get supplies here when they're needed. And they spend a lot of money. That's like the other aspect. So, I mean, like in simplest terms, it's like, that's what I think generally how we can be perceived within the supply chain. But I view my role as really trying to support our teams as they interact with, whether it's on a local basis at the hospitals, whether it's from a corporate standpoint. What are things that we are doing in supply chain that are impacting us financially? Where are things happening from a utilization or pricing standpoint that are impacting the organization? And so I try to wrap all those things that we do. We've got 600 associates that work in supply chain. How do I wrap all that up and package it in different ways to different audiences based on what they need to know or want to know about us?
I have just a logistics question, Jordan, on how it's laid out. Obviously, not a lot of systems have a CFO of supply chain. To me, that's somewhat of a unique position. How do you interface with the CFO and the C-suite overall of Bon Secours Mercy? How does that relationship work, and is there duplication there?
Sure. No, great question. Yeah, I think my role is unique. There's other certainly finance partners, I would say, in a lot of supply chain organizations. My role really started because we built and launched a GPO back in 2021 for Bon Secours Mercy Health. And then also, I think just to help, because of my background, I've worked in the for-profit space in both for community health systems as well as for med device company, as a biomed. So really had a background to help maybe meld the two together and bring some maybe insight that may be lacking back to the organization. In terms of how we interact in supply chain with our CFO of the organization, so just from a simple reporting structure, I report up to the chief supply chain officer, and our chief supply chain officer reports to the CFO of Bon Secours Mercy Health. So there's a very close connection between supply chain and then the CFO of our organization. I actually get a chance to meet with him tomorrow for a while. So the connection is very close. I mean, outside of employment expense, supply and pharmaceutical expense is number 2 on the P&L. And so we have to be lockstep with our CFO for him to know what's going on within our within the organization. And certainly as just being a heavy expense center, he's got to know what we know.
Makes a lot of sense. So that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times too, supply chain has been focused on savings. Now I think there are, potentially some revenue opportunities for supply chain, and it's really shaping up to be a very different conversation. But a disconnect between finance and supply chain was always like, oh, I just saved us X amount of dollars. And it's like, well, you signed a contract that we hope will save us X amount of dollars. But for the finance perspective, until it's realized, it hasn't actually happened, right? So how do you kind of navigate those conversations so that you're maybe even tracking performance of prospective savings with what is actually realized in the future?
Yeah, I think I'm sure maybe my approach wasn't always met well when I first came in, because again, I strictly a finance background prior to coming here. But to me, if like the savings isn't realized on the income statement, it's not savings. So I know our teams, and I don't want to downplay like what our teams do, because they do a wonderful job where they're dealing with pricing pressures from the vendors who are trying to push a 10% increase. They negotiate a 3% increase, and they're saying, hey, we got 7% savings. Well, that's not savings, right? We still have a 3% increase. That's not truly savings. I understand, like, hey, you mitigated, a heftier increase than maybe we would have gotten. So we've taken steps to define what is truly savings, and we use those definitions. I have a list of all the definitions for the different areas, And that's how we track savings for Bon Secours Mercy Health. So it may not look on the surface maybe as grand as what I've seen, reported in other systems, but I can assure you that what we report, hits our income statement.
Jordan, I really like that you brought up that, because we used to hear waterfall savings, cost avoidance savings.
Yeah, cost avoidance.
Yeah, you just define it, right? And speaking the language. And I think, your background in finance to an operations, logistics heavy supply chain individual, how do you communicate that? How you have to answer, obviously, to the numbers and the bottom line. Your job is to keep the doors open, keep taking care of patients and staff, get the supplies, get the capital we need. How do you communicate that or train a new supply chain individual coming in to your organization? How do you coach them up? And how do you set expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing that a leader can do is bring clarity to the teams in terms of what expectations are. And so that's why we had to go back and define what is actually savings. And again, I don't want to downplay.
No, it's fair.
What you said,
point. It really is.
The cost avoidance and whatnot. I'm not even opposed to reporting on cost avoidance, but it's not truly savings. And I think that was a connection that we made with finance, the greater finance team within Bon Secours Mercy Health, was for reporting savings. You understand that what we report is going to be reflective, maybe in the individual hospital income statements. You should see that, and if you're not, then we need to go back and look at, well, why did we report it? Why isn't it being reflected? It should be. If it's not, then there's a disconnect somewhere that we need to fix. And I think that was really important to me, to be able to have conversations and credibility with finance, is to ensure that they understand what we're saying is savings. If they can get on board with what we're saying, it makes the conversations a lot easier, and it just brings confidence in what we're bringing back to them. And I've just seen in other organizations where you have just tension built up, where some groups reporting all the savings, finance is I'm not recognizing that. That's not savings, so then you start butting heads. And so my goal, again, is trying to bring clarity to whether people like it or not, this is what it is, and this is what's being reflective. And if we're going to say our income statements are the holy grail in terms of what's actually happening from a financial perspective, then all the superlatives and things that go into that need to be understood.
Yeah, Jordan. And I think that has so much downstream to it as well. Supply chain's hearing it from the vendor community. This is savings. And they need to understand too, this is truly not savings. You have a CPI markup of 3.9% built into the agreement. Then you add and make an amendment to the agreement, and all of a sudden it's you think you're savings and you're really not. And it's I think that's really good downstream. And I think it's a fair conversation to have. I think we could talk about what savings means for a whole podcast and define it. We really could, because I think there needs to be clarity on it. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, I was going to say, Jordan, let me just hop in, because I was looking at your background. You actually did spend some time on the medical device side. How has that impacted your sitting in the seat that you sit in now? Because obviously that gave you a whole different, you looked at that, you had a different lens at that point, and now you're on the other side again. Kind of give us that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that experience.
It was a great experience. And, I found myself in the role I'm in. I never set out to work in supply chain. I think a lot of people in supply chain say that, and maybe there's just no room for us anywhere else. I don't know. But yeah, very fortunate to have the time when I worked at Zimmer Biomet that I did. It opened my eyes to the other side of the aisle, so to speak. And I think understanding perspectives, whether you're at the negotiating table, whether you're trying to put a strategy together, whatever it may be, understanding, as many perspectives as you can and why they come at you with the perspective that they have, I just think makes you better in terms of communicating, makes you better in terms of negotiating, and then, ultimately trying to figure out, problem solve on, hey, how can we all be winners in various scenarios? So my time in the med device industry really opened my eyes, because I came from community health systems, which was great too. And like I said, I just felt like when this position opened up for me, I'm like, man, this really brings in both my backgrounds really well. I think I can offer something that maybe is a little bit unique. And so I'm really grateful for the experience working in the med device industry.
I think understanding their perspectives is important. And I think when you and I talked, you actually included, the vendors in the sort of stakeholders that have to be considered for supply chain to be successful. Do you want to kind of talk through the various stakeholders and maybe what your approach is?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's clearly, stakeholders. We, think about supply chain. You got the vendors, you've got physicians, you have the hospitals or ASCs, right? Depending on where, or physician office, whatever it may be, wherever the care is delivered. Then ultimately, you have the patient, who's the ultimate stakeholder, and really what part of our mission is to ensure that ultimately the patient is taken care of the way they should be. I think generally in healthcare, that's what everyone's striving for is the healing of a patient. But within all these stakeholders, there are different incentives aren't always aligned. And that's what makes, I think, our role challenging, whether it comes to pricing, whether it comes to the quality, timeliness of delivery, whatever it may be. Incentives aren't always aligned. And that's where, I think it's one of the biggest challenges. It's not unique to Bon Secours Mercy Health. It's one of the biggest challenges within supply chain, especially when it comes to, I think, physician preference items. Incentives are not aligned. You got the vendor community trying to bring products for the physicians to use, and some of them are products that have been around a long time, the tried and true. They're also the ones creating and bringing the new technology that, we get to enjoy even as a patient that wasn't available to us 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So they're, certainly innovators in the space. Obviously, we've got the physicians who are the ones, using the products, and ultimately it's, through their hands are hopefully helping the patient, recover from whatever disease, illness that they're dealing with. You've got the hospitals who are really the catalyst for where the care is being delivered, right? Whether it's in a patient room or in the OR or the cath lab, they're responsible for ensuring they've got, staffing there to support. They've got the product there on time, the equipment that's needed. And then lastly, of course, the patient who doesn't know any of this is happening in the background. They're just hoping, post their stay that they're walking out feeling better than when they walked in. And so, it's really always trying to align, whether it's, again, just from a financial perspective, is like, how does everyone win in this space? Can everyone win in this space? And so I think those are the challenges that we're in healthcare that we're trying to battle every day.
So Jordan, quick question. Do you guys have a robust or a value analysis committee where you bring a lot of this alignment together with other additional key stakeholders when they're brought to the attention of a physician need?
We do. And I would say it's different for each of our categories.
Sure.
Some are more robust than others. And again, I don't think that's unique to us. I think some just work well better, but we don't have very specific defined service line committees the way that some other health systems may have. We do within our pharmacy area, for example. I would say that's a very robust area in terms of how we operate from a value analysis perspective. And then some of our other areas, you need more touch points or less touch points, just depending on the area.
Totally makes sense.
We have a mixture, I'd say, kind of a variety of structures depending on, the specific service line or contract
the commodity
category.
Area, for sure.
Yep. Yeah, commodity area, we work very close hand in hand with the nursing teams. And that area runs, pretty smoothly.
What's the ideal environment then? I think you mentioned to me like you were talking about ASCs, but like physician owned. Is that kind of like the ideal way to marry up some of these different perspectives and different incentives to sort of get a little bit closer together?
Well, I think, the unique thing with an ASC environment is you bring essentially two of the stakeholders becomes one if it's physician owned, right? And all of a sudden, where a physician is responsible not only for caring and treating the patient, he or she's also responsible for paying the bills, ensuring that they've got all the staffing, ensuring they've got all the equipment. And I think when you have that type of alignment right there, it's like automatically you're trying to figure out, all right, well, how can I get the best bang for my buck? How am I going to get vendors to react positively towards me? Where's my commitment going to go? Typically, it's going to be very narrow commitment in terms of vendor alignment. And that inherently just becomes from a financial perspective, inherently becomes a driver of lower pricing, because then the vendor's not worried about some of the competition coming in, right? It's already locked down, and they know they can just focus in on, that, particularly physician group that they're serving. So I think, in a lot of ways, it can be a very ideal environment. The challenge, of course, is there's certain things that can't be done in an ASC. And so you, of course, need the hospitals to support. And then, certainly I think the hospitals are getting pinched where they're losing a lot of their, procedures to ASCs that would be maybe higher paying procedures or better paying procedures. And they're kind of left with what's left. I know that's probably a common complaint, and certainly I'm sure those in the ASC space may think differently, but that's certainly a challenge for hospitals to provide better care or care more similar to an ASC, right? So it doesn't feel like you're in this giant hospital ward. It's more of a personalized care situation. But ultimately, like, again, going back to your original question, like, yeah, I think the ASC, physician-owned ASC, probably has better alignment within the vendor community because they have more control, and you take away essentially one of the stakeholders.
I feel like it's a operating unit that is sort of really tight. And so a lot of the variables are more easily controlled. And like you said, smaller amount of vendors, smaller amount of surgeons, more defined procedures. Kind of remember, it makes me think of when I read The Tipping Point. I think it was The Tipping Point. I read 2 of Gladwell's books, but they were talking about Gore-Tex. And Gore-Tex had 4 different buildings sharing the same parking lot, but they kept all of them to around 150 employees so that everybody kind of knew each other and they were able to move more quickly, even though, all 4 business operating units, sharing that parking lot were essentially doing the same things. It just made it manageable. When you start to kind of contrast that against the hospital or the acute environment, I think one of the things that we hear a lot for consultants is they'll say things like margin improvement. Like, people aren't even talking about savings or revenue anymore. They're talking about margin improvement. But you talked about reimbursement on the products. And I think one of the other disconnects is really that visibility to margin, because you might negotiate a contract, but supply chain may not be aware of the reimbursement. And a lot of that value analysis sort of process is supposed to pull that out. But I feel like finance doesn't necessarily get engaged to the kind of level that you might want to really maximize margin. Could you speak to that, in your experience?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up, because this is one of the, I would say one of the top priorities for the CFO of our company is to help bring clarity to all these aspects within, our service lines. We have all the information, we have all the data, but to your point, Justin, it's not always apparent, or maybe we're using different systems or different data points to pull this information in. And so I think service line visibility around margin, where you're bringing in, obviously volumes, you're bringing in the revenue, the payer mix, you're bringing in the staffing element, the the supply and pharmaceutical costs, like all these elements that go into these service lines. And then of course, like service lines in and of itself are very broad. Like you can get, these sub service lines or, subcategories within that. To get more specific, it's incredibly important because if we operate too much in a silo, I think there's a lot of opportunities missed where, potentially from a supply chain standpoint, should we be partnering with our managed care teams more as they go into their negotiations where we can say, hey, from a supply standpoint, we're actually one of the lowest cost providers when it comes to delivering care for this patient population or these specific service lines. That's where I think bringing and honing in this information can help, I think, progress us in the future with negotiations with payers, right? Then it becomes less about, it just becomes more comprehensive and allows us, I think, to do things maybe a little bit differently or enhance what we're doing today a little bit more.
Jordan, I was going to say, I hear that same sentiment on our pharmacy group, is that on the managed care contracts, the pharmacy they're not being heard there. And therefore, some of the agreements and things that are being negotiated on are excluding high price, cell therapies and whatnot. And there's a lot of lost money potential there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the blessing and the curse of what we have today of information and data is that we have too much information and data. It's even hard to parse through, like, hey, what should we be bringing to the forefront and to whom, and what's actually valuable to others that we don't even think about. And like I said before, our CFO is making has put a press on, really all of his direct leaders to, hey, we've got to bring this stuff together. We have the information. We need to bring it better in digestible ways for all of us to be able to use and understand. And that's going to require us to learn a little bit more about each other's areas, get a little uncomfortable getting outside supply chain and understanding the managed care world and vice versa. Get to understand the operations a little bit better. What are they dealing with, at the sites? And so all those elements, right? You just I think in the end, if we don't use the information in a way that becomes us better operators and better strategic operators, I would say, then we're not doing our job.
Jordan, just a comment. I really like the fact that you're like, get out of our comfort zone, start understanding the downstream of the payers. I think that is like, there's a lot of hesitation. Like, I'm supply chain, operations, logistics. I'm going to make sure you need what you need. But down the road, like when we're talking to finance, we've got to understand that. I mean, I've seen it in a gain sharing agreement. I've seen downstream where you've got to understand that to a piece to have a successful conversation with the Jordans of the world, right? And that's how you're talking finance with supply chain. It's like little bits and pieces of that growth with supply chain. So I think you bring up a really, really relevant point on the next piece. We've got to get out of it. We've got to get in that uncomfortable zone 100%.
Yeah, and I think you don't have to be an expert, right? But it's understanding enough to ask the right questions or just understand how what I do impacts others. And it's hard, right? You don't know what you don't know, but at the same time, you have to have a willing parties across your teams to say, yeah, let me take some time to do that. And again, I'll brag on our CFO, all day. He does a great job of bringing us all together and forcing these types of conversations to take place and really wants us to grow in that way.
And it really, it's understanding the conversation you're having with, like, Jordan, why are you sitting in that seat? Why are you asking those questions? To really understand your customer, your partnership, the person you're visiting with. Like, I know Justin and I every day try to figure out where Hayes is coming from. We really work hard to try to understand why Hayes does what Hayes does. So we get it. We get it. Sorry, Hayes. Couldn't resist.
If you figure it out, let me know.
I've got Claude AI working on it. We'll have it solved by the end of the week.
It's a Malcolm Gladwell, Hayes Waldrop. Next story. There we go.
But to Jordan, that point, Justin, like you've got to be able to, if you're using AI or AI tools, your AI is only going to be so smart as the prompts, right? And so again, if you know the right questions and the right things to bring forward, you can get that information back. Whether again is from a Claude, or it's from having a conversation with our operators or our managed care teams or our real estate partners. Just knowing how to ask or what questions to ask is so important.
Huge.
Yeah. I think as we've kind of put a bow on this one of the things you had mentioned, like your CFO does a great job of pulling everybody to the table and trying to get that conversation going and get that collaboration happening. I'm interested. What have you learned about how to talk supply chain to the CFO? How do you translate that? And, maybe I can see this being a good takeaway for some of the people listening in today.
Well, you have to understand what does your CFO care about? And I think first and foremost, they're mostly concerned about the financial health of the organization, as they should be. And so for me, what drives expense? What drives our inventory? Those are the important things that if I can't answer to our CFO, we're not going to get too deep into supply chain. And so I think for me to bring, and our teams, it's not just me, it's all of our teams, right? Because we serve, 35, 36 hospitals that all have hospital CFOs, right? And so if our leaders don't know how to speak to our CFOs locally, we're going to have a hard time, I think, being trusted advisors in the supply chain space. So I think it first and foremost is understand what goes into your income statement. How are our supplies cost driven? This is basic. I mean, it's basic, and I think most people do know. But the biggest questions I always get are when the expenses don't match what the expectations were, or they're higher than budget, or they don't meet on a per stat or per revenue type stat. Well, what's driving that? And sometimes I only have half the answer because I don't always know what's happening from a payer mix standpoint. But again, it goes back to, well, we need to reconcile so we all know how all these things impact one another. And so I think that's where it starts. And then I think as your CFO, as he or she gets more and more comfortable with the information and that, hey, you can forecast, you can explain variances that maybe were unexpected. You can show, hey, our pricing is really good in this space or it's not so good in this space. And why is that? Then you can start getting into I think deeper elements of supply chain. That's really all the outcomes of what all of our teams and others are doing day in, day out. So you got to start with what does the CFO care about? And I just think they're just always concerned about the financial health. Where are they going to be able to offset inflation? What does a 5-year forecast look like? And so I think the more you can, get confident in explaining how we see it from a supply chain standpoint, I think they really will grasp that and continue to lean in on the supply chain team to, provide more insight answers as they have them.
Jordan, great job today. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights.
Appreciate it.
That was really good. Yeah, that was great. Well
Thank
done.
you so much.
Well done.
I appreciate it. A lot of fun.
That was Jordan Ohman, CFO of Supply Chain at Bon Secours Mercy Health in Hayes. Just a great conversation today. It is really difficult to align supply chain and finance sometimes. I mean, I know it depends on the environment, like you said, ASCs versus acute care. It depends on the teams. I love that he has a CFO that really engages supply chain and brings everybody around the same table to just start to talk through that. But there were some really good nuggets in the conversation today with Jordan. And I think every supply chain team should have somebody that operates with a finance mind within it.
Oh, absolutely. And I suspect that every supply chain exec out there listening to this would wishes they had a Jordan on their team for these very reasons, and or a CFO who totally is all in on supply chain. But absolutely, I loved hearing about their model, what they're doing up there. So yeah, he was a wealth of information. It was great.
All right, everybody. Well, big thanks to Jordan. And on behalf of Gary Hayes and myself, thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Bam! Bam! Boom, 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 boom.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.